About 600 years before Jesus, in ancient Greece, there was a group of people that got together, a group of philosophers that got together and decided to try to explain the natural world without recourse to theology. These ancient Greek philosophers, again, 600 years before Jesus, they wanted to explain how did the world get here and how do we account for all of the different things. There's animals, plants, minerals, all of the plurality of things in nature, but they didn't want to make recourse to the gods, to the divine, or to the ancient theological stories that were handed on. It's actually human beings' first formal rejection of the divine. So without having recourse to Zeus or Poseidon, I don't think they might have known about the one true God worshipped by the Israelites, or, the Egyptian pantheon of gods. They wanted to be able to explain things with science, with just, and so that's where they got together and started talking about these things. And they came up with the four primary elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. Any of that sound familiar? Where do you see that? Our windows. Our stained glass windows are earth, air, fire, and water. So one of those ancient Greek philosophers said, well, so how did we get everything? How did life come to be? And they didn't want to say, well, God created. So they came up with, earth. Obviously, you plant a seed in the ground, and it comes to life and springs forth, and it brings forth new life. So obviously, earth, dirt, is the origin of all things. And from earth came everything else that we have, came life and the natural order of things. And then some other philosopher came along and said, no, air is the primary element. For example, hold your breath and see how long you live. Air is necessary for life. And there's hot air and there's cold air, and different mixtures of the hot and the cold is how we got the plurality of things that we see in nature. And then another philosopher came forward and said, no. Fire is the primary element. Because just look at the sun. And what happens if the sun were to get extinguished? Everything would grow cold and die. So fire has to be the primary element in how we got everything in the world. And then yet another person came forward and said, no, it's water. You can plant a seed in the ground and ain't nothing going to happen unless you water it. And hydration is very necessary. You could live for, I don't know how long without food, but you can live, if you're just drinking water, you could live longer, right? Isn't it a month or so? At any rate. So water is primary. Water is the primary element. And so these philosophers were debating, how did we get everything? How did we get everything in the natural world? And they tried to do it with science rather than, again, with recourse to the stories that you and I were taught and grown up with, without recourse to the divine, without recourse to the gods. And these elements continue to appear even in our culture today. There was the musical group Earth, Wind, and Fire. It's a reference to that. There was a movie called The Fifth Element, and I recommend that you not see it, but it was about, there were the four principal elements, and then Mila Jovovich herself was the fifth element. Don't see the movie, at any rate. But I mean, it's still these, even today, these elements appear, and I'm having learned this in Philosophy 101 in college seminary, I'm aware, and so I'm always looking for, and I notice, and so when I first got here 2 years ago, I said, oh, earth, wind, fire, water, look at this. Human beings' first formal rejection of the divine, so prominently in our church. And the debate continues to this day with the debate between evolution and creation, right? Even today, there are still some who debate evolutionism and creationism. And I will say that evolution, supported by natural selection, is incomplete, and doesn't explain everything. Creationism is where we take the literal interpretation of Genesis, of the creation. God spoke, and then everything came into being. Creationism is wrong too. Did that get your attention? Creationism misuses the Bible. The Bible was not meant to be used as a scientific text to explain how the created world came to be. The Bible tells us, as a matter of fact, we cannot take literally the story of creation because there isn't just one story of creation in the first couple of chapters of Genesis. How many stories are there of creation? 2. And they're contradictory. There's 2 different stories of creation in the beginning of Genesis, and they don't match up. There are 2 very different stories. Using the Bible to explain what those Greek philosophers were trying to explain is misusing the Bible. The Bible and creation, our story of creation in the Bible, is meant to answer the question, not how. It's not meant to answer the question how we got everything, how creation came into being. The Bible is meant to answer the question, who? Who created us? It was God. It also answers the question, why? Why did God create us? Out of love. Out of love. The Bible is not a scientific text. Again, the literal interpretation of the Bible says that the world was created about 10,000 years ago, and science has disproven that. So the world is much older than that. But the Bible is meant to answer the question, who and why. Those are the more important questions. God created us, and God created us out of love. So, there are even theologians, and I learned this in the seminary, and I've in my research this past week, even the Pope has come out and said, perhaps God used evolution as a means of creation. Theologians have said that, and even the Holy Father has come out and said that. If you do a Wikipedia search on evolution versus creationism, it has his quote in there. And so the question is raised, well, who won the debate, evolutionists or creationists? The debate kind of just fell apart because the Bible was not meant to be used that way, and science is helpless in answering the most important questions, the who and the why. How? Science can answer that, how, but who and why, science has no answer for that. I'll give you another example. Science can tell us everything about, science can map everything about the human emotion of love. There's evolutionary psychology, there's neurochemistry, the role of the limbic system, there's brain imaging. All of that we can put together, pool all of that together, and we can get the physiological explanation of the human emotion, of what happens in the brain of love. Answer me this. Does all of that even come close to describing the love that a mom has for a baby? We can get the scientific underpinnings for it, but it don't even come close to describing the love between a husband and a wife, or a parent for a child. That's left to religion. And so So, all right, so with that, please open to page 22 in the Missalette. This is the first reading today. On page 22, we have a reading from the book of Kings, 1 Kings chapter 19. I'll tell you, 1 Kings was written, guess how many years before Jesus? 600. About the same time that all of this was happening. I don't know if they talked to each other, the writer of 1 Kings and the Greek philosophers, but it was concurrent. At the mountain of God, Horeb, Elijah came to a cave where he took shelter. Then the Lord said to him, are we all together? Yeah? Go outside and stand on the mountain before the Lord will be passing by. A strong, heavy wind, right there, was rending the mountains and crushing rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. The answer is not just in the wind. After the wind, there was earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After earthquake, there was fire, another one of the primary elements, but the Lord was not in the fire. At this point, I think the writer of 1 Kings said, well, I made my point, because he didn't include water. God is not to be found in science. God is found in relationship with us. Okay, and so, there was fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire, there was a tiny whispering sound. God is found in the stillness of our hearts. When he heard this, Elijah hid his face in his cloak and went and stood at the entrance of the cave because he knew he had found God. I've been waiting so long to give this homily about earth, wind, fire, and water. This reading only comes up once every 3 years. But just because, again, it's so common in our society, and when you know what you're looking for, and we have it in our church, the way we can enjoy this is that God created earth and air and fire and water. But we can't confuse science with God. God is greater.